At exactly 8:17 p.m., rain hammered the empty Ohio highway so hard that even the headlights blurred into silver streaks. Kneeling beside a stranded sedan, Joan Rogers tightened one final bolt with bare hands scarred by burns cuts and years of engine grease that no soap could ever erase. A faded red shop towel hung from her jacket pocket, soaked by the storm. When a black Rolls-Royce pulled onto the shoulder, the billionaire who stepped out reached for an umbrella until he saw her hands. He froze without saying a word. Somehow, those battered hands told a story that money never could. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. If stories about quiet courage and second chances speak to your heart, we'd love to have you join our growing community by subscribing. At 4:45 every morning, long before the first commuters filled the roads around Columbus, Ohio, Joan Rogers was already awake. She never needed an alarm anymore. For years, her body had learned to wake before responsibility had the chance to knock. She slipped quietly out of bed, careful not to make the old wooden floor creak. The small two-bedroom house had belonged to her parents for nearly 40 years. The wallpaper had faded. The kitchen cabinets no longer closed properly. The furnace complained every winter. Yet Joan treated the place with the same respect she gave every engine she repaired. Things lasted longer when someone cared enough to maintain them. She filled a kettle with water and placed it on the stove. While it heated, she opened a worn notebook lying beside the refrigerator. Every page contained careful handwriting, customer names, repair estimates, medication schedules for her father, grocery lists, and monthly expenses calculated down to the last dollar. The number at the bottom of the page never seemed to change. $86.43. That was everything left in her checking account until Friday. She quietly crossed out milk from today's shopping list. They could manage another day without it. The kettle whistled. She poured hot water over oatmeal, sliced half a banana into 2 bowls, and added cinnamon because it made inexpensive food feel less ordinary. Only after breakfast was ready did she walk down the hallway. "Morning, Dad." Frank Rogers was already awake, sitting on the edge of his bed while struggling to button his flannel shirt. Parkinson's disease had stolen much of the steadiness from his hands, but never his pride. "I almost had it," he said with a stubborn smile. "I know you did." She finished the last button without making him feel helpless. That mattered. Frank had spent nearly 50 years working beneath lifted pickup trucks, rebuilding transmissions, and teaching apprentices that shortcuts always came with a price. Now the man whose hands had once rebuilt engines could barely hold a coffee mug without trembling. Life had a cruel sense of irony. They ate breakfast together in comfortable silence. The morning news played softly from an old television. A reporter announced another record-breaking quarter for Carter Automotive Technologies, praising CEO William Carter for unveiling the company's newest electric truck. Frank glanced toward the screen. "Smart man," Joan shrugged. "Probably. He started in a garage, didn't he?" "So they say." Frank smiled. "Funny how people forget where they came from once they start wearing suits." Joan answered with nothing more than a small smile. She had learned long ago that not every opinion deserved a response. After washing the dishes, she arranged her father's medication in a small plastic organizer. Blue pill, white pill, half of the yellow one. She checked her watch. 6:08 a.m. Time to leave. Outside sat her 15-year-old white Ford F-250 service truck. Its paint had faded unevenly under countless summers. Rust decorated the wheel wells. The driver's seat had been patched twice. The odometer had stopped working months ago. To most people, it looked ready for a junkyard. To Joan, it was simply another machine that still had work left to do. She unlocked the tool compartments one by one. Every wrench, every socket, every diagnostic scanner, every bottle of fluid. Each item had its place. Daniel had insisted on that. She paused as her fingers brushed against a faded red shop towel folded neatly inside the toolbox. She unfolded it carefully. The embroidered initials DR had almost disappeared after years of grease and washing. Daniel Rogers. Her husband. She held the cloth for only a second before placing it inside her jacket pocket, every single workday, without exception. It wasn't superstition. It was companionship. 15 years earlier, Daniel had laughed every time she reached for the wrong wrench. "Don't fight the engine," he used to say. "Listen first." She could still hear his voice whenever she opened the hood of a car. People often assumed mechanics relied only on tools. Daniel believed the best tool was patience. Then came the construction site accident. A crane cable snapped. 3 workers never made it home. Daniel was one of them. Everything changed in one afternoon. Hospital bills, business loans, insurance disputes, customers disappeared. Within 11 months, Rogers Family Auto closed forever. Joan sold nearly everything they owned to settle debts. The building, the equipment, even Daniel's prized vintage Mustang project. Only his toolbox and the red towel remained. She refused to sell those. Never once did she ask strangers for donations. Never once did she create an online fundraiser. When neighbors quietly left grocery gift cards in her mailbox, she thanked them with homemade pies once life became stable enough to afford flour again. Pride was not about refusing kindness. It was about giving something back whenever possible. Her phone buzzed. Today's appointments appeared. Brake replacement, battery issue, alternator inspection, oil leak. Nothing glamorous, just honest work. At her first stop, an elderly man apologized repeatedly for only being able to pay part of the invoice. Joan looked underneath his pickup before closing the hood. The brakes needed replacing more than the battery. What? You were quoted for both. He blinked. The dealership said. They were wrong. She crossed out nearly $300 from the estimate. You don't need work you don't actually need. The old man stared at her. You could have made more money. Joan simply smiled. I like sleeping at night. He insisted on paying her an extra $20 anyway. She accepted only $10. By noon, the sky had turned dark. Heavy clouds rolled across central Ohio much earlier than forecast. The weather alert on her phone flashed repeatedly. Severe thunderstorm warning. Expected wind gusts over 60 miles per hour. Possible flash flooding. She looked upward. So much for an easy afternoon. Rain began as scattered drops. Within 20 minutes, it became a wall of water. Customers canceled one after another. Most repair shops had already closed for the evening. Joan considered driving home. Frank would worry. The roads were getting dangerous. Then her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. This is Joan. A woman's frightened voice nearly disappeared beneath the roar of wind. Please, someone gave me your number. My car died on Route 33. I'm a pediatric nurse. I'm supposed to start my night shift in less than an hour. Joan glanced toward the rain crashing against her windshield. Are you safe? I think so, but I'm alone. Joan closed her eyes for a brief moment. Home was 20 minutes west. The stranded driver was nearly 40 minutes east. Logic told her to turn around. Conscience chose differently. I'll come. You don't even know if I can afford. We'll figure that out later. Joan ended the call, started her old truck and reached into her jacket pocket. Her fingers wrapped around Daniel's faded red towel. As thunder rolled across the darkening sky, she whispered the words she had repeated before every difficult repair since the day she lost him. Listen first. Then she drove straight into the storm. The conference had ended with applause loud enough to shake the ballroom. Executives stood, cameras flashed, and reporters crowded the front of the stage as William Carter finished answering questions about the company's newest electric truck. Headlines would celebrate another record quarter. Financial analysts would praise his leadership before sunrise. Investors would call it another victory. William barely noticed. He thanked the audience with practiced courtesy, shook a dozen hands, and walked off stage carrying nothing except a leather notebook that had been with him for nearly 20 years. His assistant, Ethan Brooks, caught up with him outside the ballroom. "The investors' dinner starts in 45 minutes. We're skipping it." Ethan blinked. "Sir, I'm tired of hearing people congratulate me for numbers. You've been preparing for this launch for almost 2 years." "I know." William adjusted the cuff of his navy overcoat. "I'd rather go home." The words surprised even him. For most of his career, home had been a hotel suite somewhere between New York, Detroit, Chicago, or Los Angeles. Success had taught him how to build companies. It had never taught him how to slow down. The black Rolls-Royce waited beneath the covered entrance. Rain had already begun to fall. As William settled into the back seat, his driver, Marcus Hill, looked through the rearview mirror. Airport. William stared at the rain sliding across the window. "No." "The house in Columbus?" "Yes." Marcus nodded quietly and eased the car into traffic. For several miles, neither man spoke. The silence suited William. He opened the leather notebook resting on his lap. Most people assumed it contained business strategies. Instead, every page held handwritten memories, small sentences, names, dates, lessons. The first page read, "Never forget where your hands learned to work." His father had written that sentence. Harold Carter never owned more than a modest repair garage outside Dayton. There had been only 3 service bays, concrete floors stained black by decades of oil, old jazz playing from a dusty radio, coffee that tasted terrible, customers who paid whenever they could. William remembered sweeping those floors before school. He remembered learning to identify engines by sound before he was old enough to drive. Most of all, he remembered his father's hands, large, scarred, cracked every winter. His mother used to rub ointment into those hands every night while saying the same thing. "Hard work leaves marks. Shame never should." William smiled faintly at the memory. Then another memory arrived, as it always did. His younger brother, Andrew, 3 years younger, always laughing, always rushing, always believing people deserved another chance. Andrew had ignored William's warnings one rainy evening almost 30 years earlier. His pickup had begun making strange noises during a road trip. A roadside garage offered to repair it quickly. Cheaply. They assured him everything was safe. It wasn't. A steering component failed less than 20 miles later. Andrew never survived the crash. The investigation revealed shortcuts, used parts sold as new, bolts tightened improperly, records falsified. William attended every court hearing. He listened to excuse after excuse. One phrase haunted him more than any other. "We didn't think it would matter." It mattered. From that day forward, William stopped trusting small repair shops. He invested his life into building vehicles with uncompromising standards. Quality became his religion. Precision became his language. People admired him for it. Few understood why. Marcus interrupted his thoughts. "The storm's getting worse." Rain now slammed against the windshield with enough force to drown out the engine. The interstate slowed. Hazard lights blinked everywhere. Tree branches bent violently under the wind. Ethan called. William answered. "The board wants confirmation you'll attend tomorrow's breakfast meeting." "I won't." "They're expecting you." "They'll survive disappointment." A pause. "Sir, you've changed lately." William looked toward the darkness outside. "Maybe. You've been canceling meetings." "I've been attending too many funerals." Ethan didn't answer. William ended the call gently. The truth was impossible to explain. During the previous year, 3 retired employees had died within months of one another. Every memorial service sounded the same. They spoke about productivity, revenue, awards, very little about kindness, very little about family. William had begun wondering whether success measured the wrong things. Marcus slowed the car again. Accident ahead. Several vehicles had pulled onto the shoulder. Emergency lights flashed through sheets of rain. A tow truck struggled to reach an SUV trapped in a ditch. Traffic crawled. William watched silently as exhausted drivers waited inside their cars. Then, several miles later, something unusual caught his eye. Far ahead on the opposite shoulder stood a faded white pickup truck with amber work lights glowing through the storm. Behind it, another sedan sat with its hood open. There was no police cruiser, no tow truck, only one person, a woman. She knelt beside the disabled car despite the relentless rain. Marcus glanced toward the shoulder. Must be waiting for roadside assistance. William continued watching. No. Marcus frowned. What makes you say that? Look closer. The woman wasn't standing around helplessly. She had removed the engine cover. Tools lay organized on a waterproof mat despite the wind. A flashlight rested between her shoulder and neck. She never hesitated. Every movement looked practiced, deliberate, almost graceful. Marcus drove another 50 yards. William leaned forward. Slow down. Marcus eased off the accelerator. You want to stop? William didn't answer immediately. He kept watching. The woman reached deeper into the engine compartment. Rain soaked her jacket completely. She never seemed to notice. Then she removed one glove. Only one. She needed bare fingers for precision. The work light illuminated her left hand. William's breathing stopped for a heartbeat. Scars, burn marks, old cuts crossing her knuckles, skin permanently darkened by grease embedded over countless years. These were not the hands of someone pretending to know mechanics. These were the hands of someone who had earned every mark. His father's hands had looked exactly like that. For the first time in decades, William wasn't seeing a stranger. He was seeing the garage where he had grown up. He was seeing Harold Carter tightening bolts long after sunset. He was seeing his mother applying ointment before bed. Marcus spoke softly. Should I keep driving? William stared through the rain. No. The answer came almost instinctively. Pull over. Marcus carefully guided the Rolls-Royce onto the shoulder several yards behind the old service truck. William picked up the umbrella resting beside him. Then, before opening the door, he looked once more at the woman working alone beneath the storm. Somewhere deep inside, a belief he had carried for nearly 30 years had begun to crack. He didn't understand why. Not yet. But for reasons he couldn't explain, he knew one thing with complete certainty. He had not stopped because of the broken car. He had stopped because of the woman repairing it. Rainwater streamed off William Carter's umbrella as he stepped onto the shoulder of Route 33. The wind immediately tried to pull it from his hand. For a moment he simply stood there, watching. The woman never looked up. She was completely absorbed in the engine before her. One knee pressed into the soaked pavement, the flashlight still balanced between her shoulder and neck. Every tool she needed lay in perfect order on a rubber service mat beside her. Even in the middle of a thunderstorm, nothing appeared scattered. William noticed that first. Discipline, not desperation. He walked closer. Ma'am? Joan Rogers glanced over her shoulder for less than a second. I'll be with you in just a minute. Her voice was calm, not hurried, not irritated, simply focused. William waited. She reached deeper into the engine compartment, loosened a wiring connector, listened carefully, then asked the nervous driver standing beside her. When did it stall? Grace Collins hugged her rain-soaked jacket tighter. About 15 minutes ago. Any warning lights before that? The battery light came on for maybe 10 seconds. And after it died? It tried to start twice. Joan nodded. Good. Grace looked confused. Good. You stopped trying. Grace blinked. I didn't want to make it worse. You didn't. Joan smiled gently. Most people keep cranking the engine until they destroy the starter. She reached for a multimeter. William watched every movement. No wasted motion. No guesswork. Only quiet confidence. Finally, Joan stood and faced him. The rain had soaked her brown hair against her forehead. What can I do for you? William lifted the umbrella slightly. I thought you might need this. She looked at it, then smiled with genuine appreciation. That's kind of you. But I need both hands. He hesitated. I could hold it. Joan looked toward the engine. If you're willing to stand still for a few minutes. William nodded. I can manage that. She returned to work while William held the umbrella over the open hood. It was probably the first time in decades he had stood beside an engine instead of inside a boardroom. The familiar smell surprised him. Motor oil, warm metal, rain hitting hot components. The scent transported him backward 35 years. Harold Carter humming old country songs while replacing brake pads. William handing him wrenches. His father saying, "Never rush a diagnosis. Engines don't lie. People do." Joan interrupted his memory. Could you shine your phone light right here? William immediately obeyed. She pointed toward a narrow section near the alternator. Just there. He aimed the light carefully. She leaned closer. The scars on her hands became even more visible. There was a long burn mark running across the back of her left hand. A deep white scar crossed 2 knuckles. Her fingertips looked permanently roughened. William couldn't stop staring. Those hands had worked for decades, not weeks, not months, years. Joan noticed his silence. They're ugly. William looked up. What? My hands. She continued tightening a connector. People usually notice. They're not ugly. She gave a small laugh. You don't have to be polite. I'm not. She paused for the first time. Their eyes met. William continued quietly. They look experienced. Joan smiled faintly. That's a nicer word. Grace interrupted nervously. Is it bad? Joan returned to the engine. No, you sound pretty confident. I've heard this sound before. You have. Hundreds of times. She reached inside once more. The alternator isn't your problem? Grace frowned. The dealership told me I'd probably need a new alternator. Joan shook her head. They're guessing. William raised an eyebrow. You can tell already. Joan glanced toward him. You grew up around engines? He smiled slightly. Something like that. I can tell. How? You've been looking at the right parts. That answer caught him completely off guard. Most people recognized him from magazines or television. She was reading him through the engine instead. Joan continued speaking while working. If someone watches the battery first, they're usually inexperienced. She pointed with her wrench. If they keep looking over here... She tapped the wiring harness. They've probably spent time under a hood. William almost laughed. You noticed all that. I notice everything when I'm fixing a car. A loud crack of thunder echoed overhead. Grace flinched. Joan didn't. Instead, she asked calmly, Do you have 10mm socket? Grace looked confused. William instinctively answered, Deep socket or standard? Joan looked at him with surprise. Deep! He searched the neatly arranged tools. Everything sat exactly where it should. Within seconds, he handed her the correct socket. She accepted it without speaking. 5 minutes later, she looked up again. You organized these? No? You found it awfully fast. William smiled. My father would have been disappointed if I hadn't. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then Joan nodded with quiet understanding. So your father was a mechanic? He was. The good ones never stop teaching. No, they don't. She removed one final connector. Then she took Daniel's faded red shop towel from her pocket and carefully wiped moisture away before reconnecting the wiring. William noticed how gently she handled the cloth. Not like a rag, like something precious. Old towel. Joan looked down. My husband's. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The answer carried enough weight on its own. William quietly apologized. I'm sorry. So am I. Her voice remained steady. But grief doesn't tighten bolts. She smiled softly. So I keep working. William had attended hundreds of leadership seminars. None had taught resilience as simply as that sentence. Joan stepped back. Grace. Yes. Try it now. Grace climbed into the driver's seat. She turned the key. The engine cranked once, then came alive with a smooth, steady idle. Grace gasped. Oh my goodness. She climbed out, almost laughing through tears. You fixed it. Joan listened carefully for several seconds. No warning lights. No vibration. No unusual idle. She closed the hood gently. You'll want the battery terminals cleaned in a month or two, but you're safe to drive tonight. Grace reached for her purse. How much do I owe you? Joan glanced at the rain still falling. You said you're a pediatric nurse. Grace nodded. I'm already late. Then go take care of your kids. But we'll settle the bill later. Grace's eyes filled. I can't let you do this. Joan handed her a small business card. Mail me whatever you think is fair. Grace looked down at the card. People don't do that anymore. Joan smiled. Some still do. Grace hugged her before climbing into the sedan. Within seconds, the taillights disappeared into the rain. Silence returned to the highway. William looked at Joan. You don't even know if she'll send anything. Joan folded Daniel's red towel and tucked it back into her pocket. I know. You trust strangers that much. She locked her toolbox. No. William waited. I trust the kind of person who worries more about getting to sick children than about paying a mechanic. The answer stayed with him. She wasn't trusting blindly. She was paying attention. Just as she listened to engines, she listened to people. And somehow she could hear what most of the world never even noticed. The storm finally eased sometime after midnight. By the time William Carter returned home, the rain had faded into a gentle drizzle that tapped softly against the windows of his lakefront house. The lights inside turned on automatically as he entered, illuminating polished hardwood floors, carefully selected artwork, and rooms so spacious they often felt empty. Marcus placed the umbrella by the front door. Good night, sir. Good night, Marcus. The house fell silent. William removed his overcoat but made no effort to go upstairs. Instead, he walked into his study where floor-to-ceiling bookshelves surrounded a large oak desk. Framed photographs covered one wall, factory openings, charity events, awards, presidents, governors, groundbreaking ceremonies. Not one photograph showed Harold Carter's old garage. He noticed that for the first time. He sat in his leather chair but didn't open his laptop. Instead, he unfolded the leather notebook. Under today's date, he wrote only one sentence. I met someone whose hands reminded me of Dad. He stared at the words for several moments before closing the notebook again. Sleep never came. By 6 o'clock the following morning, Ethan Brooks was surprised to receive an unusually early phone call. Good morning, sir. I need you to find someone. Ethan immediately reached for his tablet. Who? A mobile mechanic. Silence. A mechanic. A woman. William looked out the study window toward the gray morning sky. Her name is Joan Rogers. Ethan waited for an explanation that never came. What exactly would you like me to find? Everything. Everything? Business history? Family? Professional licenses? Former employees? Property records? Lawsuits? Community reputation? Ethan typed rapidly. Should I involve corporate security? William considered the question. No. I don't want anyone following her. I don't want cameras. I don't want intimidation. I simply want facts. Understood. And Ethan? Yes, sir? If there's anything charitable attached to her name, William paused. I'd like to know whether she advertised it. The call ended. By mid-afternoon, Ethan returned, carrying a thick folder. He had expected to find an ordinary roadside mechanic struggling to stay in business. Instead, he found a story that grew more remarkable with every page. William motioned for him to begin. Joan Rogers, 42 years old, licensed master automotive technician, graduated top of her technical program 20 years ago. William nodded quietly. What else? She and her husband, Daniel Rogers, opened Rogers Family Auto 18 years ago. Ethan slid several photographs across the desk. One showed a modest brick garage with 3 service bays. Another captured a community barbecue held in the parking lot. Children laughed beside classic cars. Neighbors smiled beneath handmade banners. The building looked alive. William studied every detail. It was successful. For quite a while. Customers consistently rated them highly. Repeat business was exceptional. No consumer complaints. No fraud claims. No lawsuits. So, what happened? Ethan opened another section of the file. Daniel Rogers. He spoke more softly. Construction accident. William's expression changed. When, 11 years ago, he was volunteering to repair heavy equipment for a non-profit housing project. A crane cable failed. William lowered his eyes. Go on. The insurance settlement took almost 2 years. The legal expenses were significant. The business survived for less than another year. William turned another page. Mortgage documents, equipment sales, debt settlements. Everything had been sold. Everything except a small list handwritten on the final inventory sheet. Daniel's toolbox, red shop towel, family photographs, nothing else. William remembered seeing the faded red cloth tucked inside Joan's pocket. He suddenly understood why she had folded it so carefully. Ethan continued. There's something else. What? She could have declared bankruptcy. But she didn't. William looked up. She paid everyone. Every supplier. Every employee. Every outstanding invoice. It took years. William remained silent. Many corporations with far greater resources had chosen easier paths. Joan hadn't. What about government assistance? Very little. She qualified for more. Apparently, she only accepted temporary medical assistance while caring for her father. No long-term aid. William leaned back slowly. And her father? Frank Rogers. Retired mechanic. Diagnosed with Parkinson's 6 years ago. He now lives with Joan. Ethan hesitated again. There's another pattern. William could tell by his tone that it mattered. What pattern? Ethan placed several repair invoices on the desk. I almost missed it. William examined them. Different names, different vehicles, different dates. The labor charges seemed inconsistent. One customer paid full price, another paid half, another almost nothing. William frowned. Accounting errors. I thought so. So I called a few customers. You called them personally. I was curious. And Ethan smiled. They all told nearly the same story. He read from his notes. She charged me what I could afford. Another page. She said fixing my truck mattered more than arguing over money. Another. She wouldn't let my kids see me crying because I couldn't pay. William listened without speaking. The file was no longer about a mechanic. It was about character. Did anyone mention publicity? Ethan shook his head. Actually, they all said the opposite. One customer told me Joan becomes uncomfortable whenever anyone tries to thank her publicly. William smiled faintly. Imagine that. Ethan laughed. In today's world, it's unusual. William stood and walked towards the window. Far below, employees crossed the company courtyard carrying laptops and coffee. Thousands of people worked because he had built an empire, yet he couldn't remember the last time anyone described him with the warmth these strangers used when speaking about Joan Rogers. His success had created admiration. Her kindness had created loyalty. There was a difference, a significant one. Ethan broke the silence. Sir, may I ask something? William nodded. Why are we doing all this? William remained quiet for several seconds. Finally, he answered honestly. My entire career, I believed quality alone defined a great mechanic. He looked down at his own hands. Smooth, clean, softened by years behind conference tables rather than workbenches. Yesterday, I met someone who reminded me that integrity matters just as much. Ethan watched him carefully. So what now? William smiled, in a way Ethan hadn't seen for years. Now, I'd like to become her customer. No introductions. No corporate meetings. No television cameras. Just one old truck. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You own an old truck? William almost laughed. My father's. The words hung quietly in the room. Harold Carter's 1982 Ford F-150 had been sitting inside a climate-controlled warehouse for decades. It had never been restored, never displayed, never sold. William had always told himself he was preserving it for sentimental reasons. Perhaps the truth was different. Perhaps he had simply been waiting for someone he trusted enough to touch it. And for the first time in nearly 30 years, he believed he had finally found that person. 3 mornings later, a faded blue 1982 Ford F-150 rolled slowly into the gravel parking lot outside Joan Rogers' small workshop. The truck looked nothing like the polished collector vehicles displayed at auto shows. Its paint had dulled with time. The chrome bumper carried tiny rust spots. The driver's seat had a tear along one edge that someone had repaired decades earlier, with thick brown thread. To most people, it was simply an old pickup. To William Carter, it was the last place where his father still seemed alive. Marcus stopped the truck and looked at William. You sure you don't want me to tell her who you are? William shook his head. No. And if she recognizes you, then I'll answer honestly. Marcus smiled. I've never seen you this nervous. William laughed softly. Neither have I. Joan was already outside before they stepped from the truck. She wiped her hands with Daniel's faded red shop towel and walked toward them with the same calm expression she had worn on the highway. Good morning? Morning. William returned the greeting naturally. I hope we're not interrupting. You aren't. She glanced toward the pickup. What seems to be the problem? William hesitated. It doesn't idle smoothly. When did it start? A few weeks ago. Any recent repairs? No. Original engine? Mostly. She nodded once. Let's listen. She didn't reach for a scanner. She didn't ask him to describe internet forum opinions. Instead, she climbed into the driver's seat. Mind if I start it? Go ahead. The old V8 came to life with a rough, uneven rhythm. Joan closed her eyes. William noticed. She wasn't looking at gauges. She was listening. After perhaps 15 seconds, she shut the engine off. You've been chasing the wrong symptom. William folded his arms. I have. It's not idling rough. It only sounds that way because one cylinder is firing late. He raised an eyebrow. You can hear that? She smiled. I can hear a lot of things. She opened the hood. William instinctively moved closer. Would you mind starting it again when I ask? Of course. She leaned over the engine bay, resting one hand lightly on the intake manifold. Her fingertips barely touched the metal. Now! William turned the key. The engine started. Joan tilted her head slightly. Okay? Off. He shut it down. She reached for a flashlight. No cracked vacuum lines. No loose belts. No injector noise. She gently pressed a spark plug wire. There. William looked. I don't see anything. You won't. She pointed. The insulation's beginning to fail. It only misfires under certain conditions. He stared at the wire. It looked perfectly normal. You diagnosed that by listening. And feeling. She tapped the engine lightly. Machines talk. People just forget how to listen. The sentence landed deeper than she probably intended. William remembered his father saying almost the same thing decades earlier. Joan stepped back. How long have you owned this truck? William smiled. My father bought it new. She looked again at the faded paint. You've taken care of it. I've tried. You drive it often. Not enough. She nodded knowingly. They don't like sitting. For several minutes she worked quietly. No unnecessary conversation. No exaggerated confidence. Only steady hands. William found himself watching those hands again. The scars no longer shocked him. Instead, they fascinated him. Each one represented a lesson learned the hard way. Each mark carried history. He realized something uncomfortable. For years he had hired consultants whose hands had never repaired anything. Yet here stood a woman whose hands contained an entire education no university could teach. Joan suddenly looked up. You've worked on engines before. William smiled. I used to help my father. I figured. What gave me away? You hand me tools before I ask. He laughed. I didn't realize I was doing that. Most people don't. She reached out without looking. Half-inch wrench. William picked it up automatically and placed it into her hand. She smiled without taking her eyes off the engine. See? Neither of them noticed Marcus grinning from several yards away. For the next 20 minutes, they worked almost without speaking. It felt strangely natural, as though two people from different worlds had somehow learned the same language years earlier. Finally, Joan replaced the damaged wire, tightened everything carefully, and nodded. Try it now. William started the truck. This time the engine settled into a smooth, confident rumble. Even Marcus noticed immediately. That's a completely different truck. Joan listened for another few moments before closing the hood. There. William smiled genuinely. I've taken this to 3 different shops. They all wanted major repairs. What did they recommend? Fuel injectors. Engine mounts. Complete ignition rebuild. Joan sighed. You didn't need any of that. So I noticed. She began writing the invoice on a small paper pad. Labor, replacement wire, shop supplies, total, $74.80. William looked at the paper. That's all. She looked puzzled. Should it be more? I would have expected. He stopped himself. A much larger bill. Joan shrugged. I charge for what I fix. Not for what I could convince someone to buy. William took out his wallet. Instead of $75, he placed 5 crisp $100 bills on the workbench. Joan looked at the money, then at him. You gave me too much. I know. Please wait. She counted out exactly $75, placed the remaining cash back into his hand, and folded his fingers closed around it. "You forgot your change." William smiled. "It isn't change." "It is now." "I wanted to thank you." "You already did." "I'd like to do more." Joan shook her head gently. "If you think my work deserves another $400, tell your friends. They'll come back." "The money won't." William couldn't help smiling. "You really believe that? I've built every part of my life on repeat customers." She tucked Daniel's red towel into her back pocket. "Trust lasts longer than tips." The words lingered between them. William slipped the extra money back into his wallet. He wasn't offended. Quite the opposite. He couldn't remember the last time someone had refused his money without the slightest trace of fear or resentment. She wasn't impressed by his wealth because she hadn't built her life around it. As Marcus climbed into the truck, William paused. "May I ask you one question?" Joan nodded. "When you work on an engine, what's the first thing you look for?" She smiled. "I don't." He looked confused. "You don't?" "I listen." She rested one hand lightly against the truck's fender. "People are always in a hurry to find what's broken." She glanced toward William. "But whether it's an engine or a person, I've learned they usually tell you what's wrong if you're patient enough to listen first." William stood motionless. Those words reached somewhere far deeper than any business lecture ever had. As the old pickup pulled away, he watched Joan return to her next customer without realizing she had just repaired something much more complicated than an aging engine. She had quietly begun repairing a belief William Carter had carried inside him for almost 30 years. William told himself the visit had been about an old truck. By Friday afternoon, he knew he had been lying to himself. He wasn't thinking about spark plug wires or idle speed anymore. He was thinking about Joan Rogers. Not because she had repaired something that 3 other shops had misdiagnosed. Not because she had refused $400 without hesitation, but because she had spoken about engines the same way his father used to speak about people with patience before judgment. That thought refused to leave him. Late that afternoon, he called Ethan Brooks. "I need one favor." "You've already got it." "I don't want investigators. I don't want reports. I just want to know where Joan works tomorrow." Ethan looked confused. "You mean her appointments?" "Only the public ones. No private information. No surveillance. I simply want to see what kind of mechanic she is when she doesn't know anyone's watching." The next morning, William left the Rolls-Royce at home. He borrowed one of the company's ordinary SUVs and drove himself. It had been years since he had driven without security following behind. Oddly enough, it felt liberating. His first stop was a small elementary school on the west side of Columbus. According to Ethan, Joan had scheduled a brake inspection for one of the school's maintenance vans. William parked across the street beside a coffee shop. He watched from a distance. Joan arrived exactly 5 minutes early. She greeted the school custodian with a handshake. Not a rushed one, not a formal one. A genuine greeting. The two laughed about something before she got to work. 40 minutes later, she finished the inspection. The custodian reached into his pocket. Joan looked at the paperwork and shook her head. William couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw the older man arguing gently. Joan smiled and wrote something on the invoice. The custodian looked relieved. He shook her hand twice before she drove away. William waited until Joan disappeared before walking into the school office. The receptionist smiled politely. "Can I help you?" "I hope so." He pointed toward the parking lot. "The mechanic who was just here." "Joan?" "Yes." "She seems well liked." The receptionist laughed. "That's one way to put it." "What do you mean?" "Our maintenance van broke down last winter. We didn't have enough money in the budget." William listened carefully. Joan repaired it anyway. "And when the principal apologized for paying late," the receptionist smiled. Joan told her that buses carrying children shouldn't have to wait for accounting paperwork. William thanked her quietly. That could have been an isolated incident. He kept driving. The second stop was a small neighborhood diner called Maggie's Corner. Joan's truck sat outside beside an aging delivery van. William entered just as she finished closing the hood. A waitress in her 60s hugged Joan before she left. After Joan drove away, William ordered coffee. The waitress poured it with a smile. "You know Joan?" William asked casually. "Everybody around here knows Joan." "Good mechanic," the waitress laughed. "Honey?" "She's a better human being." William stirred his coffee. "How so?" The waitress looked toward the window where Joan's truck had disappeared. "My husband passed away 3 years ago." "I'm sorry." "So was she." William frowned slightly. "You mean, she attended the funeral?" "We weren't close friends. Just customers." The waitress wiped the counter thoughtfully. 3 weeks later, my delivery van died. I cried harder over that van than I did over some family arguments. William smiled softly. I couldn't afford another repair, so Joan fixed it. For free? No. The waitress shook her head. She charged me $20. William looked surprised. That's almost free. Exactly. And when I tried paying the rest over the next few months, the waitress smiled. She refused. What did she say? The waitress didn't need time to remember. Just promise me you'll feed someone who's hungry if they ever walk through your door. William stared into his coffee. And did you? The waitress laughed. Every Tuesday. She pointed toward a handwritten sign near the register. Free soup for anyone who needs it. No questions asked. That was Joan's payment. William looked around the diner. Construction workers, college students, an elderly couple sharing pie. Near the back sat a young man eating soup alone. The waitress quietly placed another bowl in front of him. No money changed hands. No announcement was made. The promise had survived. William suddenly understood something. Joan never gave people charity. She invited them into a chain of kindness. Nobody owed her. They owed the next person. The realization stayed with him as he left the diner. His final stop surprised him the most. Grace Collins, the pediatric nurse whose sedan Joan had repaired during the storm, had agreed to meet him outside Children's Medical Center after her shift. She recognized him immediately. The gentleman with the umbrella. William smiled. I was hoping you'd remember. I don't think I'll ever forget that night. They sat together on a bench overlooking the employee parking lot. William asked a simple question. Did Joan ever send you an invoice? Grace laughed. I mailed her a check the next morning. And she mailed half of it back. William blinked. Half, Grace nodded. There was a note. She opened her wallet carefully. I still carry it. She unfolded a small piece of paper, its edges softened from being handled so often. In neat handwriting it read, The children waiting for you needed you more than I needed the money. Take someone you love to breakfast. That will settle the rest. William read the note twice, then a third time. Grace carefully folded it again. You know what I did? What? I took my mother out for breakfast. Grace smiled through tired eyes. She'd been asking for months. I kept saying I was too busy. Her voice softened. She passed away 6 weeks later. William remained silent. If Joan hadn't written that note, Grace looked toward the hospital entrance. I would have lost that last breakfast forever. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Ambulances came and went. Parents hurried through the emergency entrance carrying frightened children. Life continued. William finally stood. Thank you. Grace nodded. Can I ask why you're looking into Joan? William thought carefully before answering. Because I believe I've spent too many years investing in machines. He glanced toward the hospital doors. And not enough years investing in people like her. As he walked back toward his SUV, he realized something extraordinary. Not one person he had spoken with mentioned Joan's skill first. They mentioned her kindness, her honesty, her quiet way of making people feel seen. The remarkable mechanic he had stopped for in the storm was becoming something far greater in his mind. She wasn't simply repairing cars. Without seeking recognition, Joan Rogers had been helping broken lives keep moving forward one honest repair. One fair invoice and one small act of trust at a time. On Monday morning, Joan Rogers drove through the front gates of Carter Automotive Technologies for the first time. She had almost declined the invitation. The email from Ethan Brooks had been polite, professional, and surprisingly brief. There had been no mention of endorsements, publicity campaigns, or investment opportunities. It simply said that William Carter wanted to show her the company's apprenticeship facilities and ask for her opinion as a working mechanic. Opinion, not approval, not permission. That single word was the reason she agreed. Her old service truck looked almost out of place among rows of sleek electric vehicles and spotless employee parking lots. She parked near the visitor entrance. Before stepping out, she looked at Daniel's faded red shop towel folded neatly on the passenger seat. "You'd probably laugh at this," she whispered. Then she tucked it into her jacket pocket. Inside the headquarters, everything gleamed. Glass walls, polished concrete floors, large digital displays showing production numbers, robotic arms assembling battery packs behind observation windows. Employees moved with quiet efficiency. Joan admired the engineering. She also noticed something else. Not a single person had grease beneath their fingernails. Ethan greeted her with a warm smile. "Miss Rogers?" "Joan is fine. I'm Ethan Brooks. It's nice to finally meet you." He led her through the building. "Our technicians have been looking forward to meeting you." "They have?" William stepped out from a nearby conference room before Ethan could answer. "They've heard someone diagnosed a misfire by ear." Joan smiled. "That's been exaggerated." William laughed. Only a little. Unlike the stormy night on the highway, he wore no expensive overcoat today. Just dark jeans, work boots, and a simple gray button-down shirt. The outfit seemed intentional. Joan appreciated the effort, though she also recognized that clothes alone couldn't erase decades of executive life. William noticed her looking toward the production floor. "What do you think? It's impressive." "You don't sound impressed." "I am," she paused. "It's just different." "In what way?" She watched a robotic arm tighten dozens of identical bolts with flawless precision. "This machine never gets tired." "No. It never worries about paying rent." William smiled faintly. "No. It never has to decide whether to charge a customer less because they need groceries." He didn't answer. Instead, he nodded. She wasn't criticizing the technology. She was reminding him of something technology could never replace: human judgment. They continued walking until they reached the apprenticeship center. About 30 young technicians worked on training engines under the supervision of instructors. Everything was spotless. Every tool hung precisely where it belonged. Every workstation looked identical. One apprentice struggled to diagnose an electrical fault. An instructor immediately corrected him. Joan observed quietly. William watched her instead. "What do you see?" She thought for a moment. "They're very well trained. But they're afraid." William frowned. "Afraid?" "They keep looking at the instructor before trusting themselves." He turned toward the apprentices. She was right. Every decision seemed to require permission. You noticed that in less than 2 minutes. "I've trained apprentices before." She smiled gently. "They don't learn confidence by borrowing yours?" William remained thoughtful as they continued. Eventually, they entered a large conference room overlooking the factory. Lunch had been prepared. Neither of them touched much of it. William folded his hands. "I'd like to ask you something." "Go ahead." "What would you change if this company were yours for one day?" Joan looked surprised. "That's a dangerous question." "I asked it anyway." She looked through the glass toward the apprentices again. "I'd let experienced mechanics teach more." "They already do." "No." She shook her head. "They supervise." "There's a difference." William leaned forward. "Explain." "I'd have retired mechanics come back. The ones who spent 40 years listening to engines. The women and men whose hands taught them things manuals never could." She smiled. "Knowledge disappears when pride retires." William slowly nodded. He wrote something in his notebook. She noticed. "You always carry that? Every day?" "My father started it." "What do you write?" "Things I don't want success to make me forget." The answer felt sincere. For the first time, Joan saw not the billionaire the news talked about, but a son still trying not to lose pieces of his father. After lunch, William led her to a prototype laboratory. A silver concept vehicle stood beneath bright lights. "Our engineers are proud of this." Joan walked around it carefully. Beautiful, innovative, elegant. Then she crouched beside one wheel. William raised an eyebrow. "You've already found something." "I might have." She pointed toward an access panel. "If someone with smaller hands has to replace this connector on the roadside." She looked back at him. "They'll probably cut themselves." One engineer frowned. "The software says maintenance time is acceptable." Joan smiled politely. "The software doesn't have knuckles." Silence filled the room. Several engineers exchanged glances. One quietly picked up a tablet and made notes. William couldn't hide his smile. She had identified a problem none of the simulations had mentioned, because simulations didn't bleed. Late that afternoon, William invited Joan into his private office. The room overlooked the entire manufacturing campus. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I've been thinking about you." Joan laughed softly. "I hope in a professional sense." "I assure you." He walked toward the window. "I'd like to make you an offer." She said nothing. "I want you to become the public face of our new skilled trades initiative." Joan's smile disappeared. William continued. "We'll fund community programs, national advertising, scholarships. You'll inspire thousands." She remained silent until he finished. Then she asked quietly, "Why me?" "Because people trust you. They will trust the campaign." Joan slowly stood. "No." William blinked. "No. I won't do it." He looked genuinely surprised. "You haven't even heard the compensation." "I don't need to." "Joan." She shook her head. "I repair cars. I teach people. I don't sell hope in commercials. This isn't advertising." "Isn't it?" The question lingered. William hesitated. She stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "If cameras follow me every time I help someone, people stop wondering whether kindness is real. They start wondering who's paying for it." William opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in years, someone had challenged one of his ideas without anger, fear, or admiration. Only honesty. Joan reached into her pocket and unfolded Daniel's faded red shop towel. She absent-mindedly smoothed a crease with her thumb. "You know what I really need?" William looked at her. "I don't need my picture on a billboard. I don't need a title. I don't need a bigger paycheck." She folded the towel carefully. "What I need is a place where young people who can't afford expensive schools can learn this trade with dignity." She looked directly into his eyes. Not because they'll make someone richer, but because honest work deserves a future. William said nothing. For several seconds, the only sound came from the factory below. He realized that once again he had tried to solve a human problem the way billionaires often did, with visibility funding and influence. Joan wasn't asking to be seen. She was asking for others to be given a chance. And those were not the same thing. William Carter barely slept that night. Long after the lights in his house had dimmed, he remained seated in his study with Harold Carter's leather notebook open in front of him. The words Joan had spoken in his office kept replaying in his mind. I don't need my picture on a billboard. He had spent decades believing that visibility created impact. Build a campaign, launch a foundation, announce a partnership, invite the press, measure the reach. But Joan had rejected the very thing countless organizations spent millions trying to secure. She didn't want attention. She wanted opportunity. Those were two very different currencies. Just before midnight, William opened to a blank page and wrote, "Stop asking how to help. Start asking what is needed." He underlined the sentence twice. The following afternoon, Ethan knocked gently on William's office door. The communications team has already started drafting concepts for the Skilled Trades Initiative. William looked up. Tell them to stop. Ethan blinked. Stop. We're canceling it. What about the launch event? Cancelled. The media interviews? Cancelled. Ethan had worked beside William for 12 years. He had never heard him abandon a project this quickly. May I ask why? William closed the notebook. Because it was my idea. I'm beginning to suspect the better ideas belong to someone else. Instead of calling Joan, William drove to her house alone that evening. No security, no assistant, no company vehicle. Just Harold's old blue pickup. The small white house looked exactly as it had during Ethan's background report. Flower boxes beneath the front windows. A weathered porch swing. A wind chime made from old socket wrenches hanging beside the door. William smiled. Only a mechanic would think of making music from worn-out tools. Before he reached the porch, he heard laughter coming from the detached garage. The large door stood open. Inside, Joan and her father, Frank Rogers, were rebuilding an old lawnmower engine together. Frank's hands trembled noticeably, but Joan never rushed him. She waited patiently while he adjusted a tiny spring. No. Frank chuckled. I've got it. I know. She smiled. Take your time. William stood quietly outside until Joan noticed him. Mr. Carter. You found us. I hope I'm not interrupting. Frank looked toward the visitor. Who's this? Joan wiped her hands with the faded red shop towel. Dad, this is William. The gentleman with the truck. Frank slowly stood. So, he extended a shaking hand. You're the man who finally listened to my daughter? William accepted the handshake warmly. I'm trying. Frank laughed. Good answer. Joan motioned toward 2 folding chairs. You want some coffee? I'd like that. The coffee was strong. Probably stronger than it needed to be. William secretly enjoyed it. For a while, they talked about ordinary things. Weather, old trucks, the price of replacement parts. Frank told stories about customers who once paid repair bills with homemade pies, fishing gear, and chickens because cash had been scarce. William laughed harder than he had in months. Eventually, Frank excused himself to take his evening medication. The garage became quiet. William looked around. Every shelf had been organized by hand, used parts carefully labeled, old carburetors stacked beside rebuilt starters. Nothing expensive, nothing luxurious. Everything useful. He finally turned toward Joan. I owe you an apology. She looked surprised. For what? I walked into your life believing I knew how to fix your problems. She smiled gently. Most people do. I was wrong. She waited. I thought money was the answer. It often helps. It does. William nodded. But it's rarely the whole answer. Joan leaned against the workbench. What changed your mind? You did. She laughed softly. I didn't do much. You did more than you realize. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed the folded proposal his staff had prepared. Then, without opening it, he tore it cleanly in half. Joan raised an eyebrow. I assume that was important. It was. What did it say? It would have made you the face of another corporate campaign. She smiled knowingly. I'm guessing that's no longer the plan. No. William placed the torn papers into a recycling bin. I came to ask a different question. He paused. What would your dream workshop look like? Joan didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked around the garage. Not because she wanted to keep it exactly as it was, but because every scratch on the workbench held a memory. Daniel teaching teenagers after school, Frank rebuilding transmissions, Saturday mornings when neighborhood kids wandered in simply to watch. Finally, she spoke. It wouldn't be fancy. William nodded. It would have enough lifts so students don't wait all day. She pointed toward an empty corner. A classroom. Not for lectures. For conversations. Where people can ask questions without feeling embarrassed. William listened without writing anything down. She continued. A tool library. So students who can't afford equipment can borrow it. A small emergency repair fund. For nurses. School bus drivers. Single parents. Anyone whose car breaking down could cost them their job. William remained silent. She hadn't mentioned herself once. Not a bigger salary, not a new house, not even replacing her old service truck. Everything she imagined belonged to someone else. What else? She smiled. I'd invite retired mechanics. The ones nobody hires anymore. They've forgotten more than most of us will ever know. William thought of Harold. He would have loved that place. Joan looked directly at him. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why are you really doing this? The question deserved an honest answer. William looked down at his hands. They were clean, perfectly trimmed, almost untouched by the kind of work his father had done every day. For a long time, I believed I honored my father by building the biggest automotive company I could. He looked toward the old tools hanging on the wall. Now I think he would have been prouder if I'd simply helped more people love the work he loved. Joan's expression softened. You know, my husband used to say something. William waited. He believed every mechanic repaired two things. The car. And the driver's peace of mind. William smiled. I like that. So did I. For a moment, neither spoke. Then William asked the question that would quietly change both of their lives. If I help build this place, he carefully chose every word, not as its owner, not as its spokesman, but simply as someone willing to carry lumber, write checks when they're actually needed, and stay out of your way. He looked at Joan with complete sincerity. Would you let me help? Joan studied him for several long seconds. She had learned years ago that character revealed itself not through speeches, but through patience. Tonight, William Carter hadn't arrived with a contract. He hadn't brought photographers. He hadn't promised to save her life. He had come with a question, and questions required humility. A slow smile appeared on her face. I think, she extended her scarred hand toward him. That's the first offer you've made that actually sounds like a partnership. William looked at her hand for a moment before taking it. The grip was firm, honest. There were no cameras, no witnesses, just two people from very different worlds shaking hands inside a modest garage that smelled of oil coffee and old memories. Neither of them realized it yet, but that quiet handshake would eventually create opportunities neither money nor talent could have built alone. The old Rogers family auto garage had been empty for almost 11 years. Its faded sign still hung crooked above the entrance, barely readable beneath layers of dust and weathered paint. Wild vines had climbed one side of the brick wall. Weeds pushed through cracks in the parking lot. One of the service bay doors refused to open more than halfway. To most people, it looked like a building whose story had already ended. Joan Rogers saw something entirely different. She saw unfinished sentences. On a cool Saturday morning, she unlocked the front door with the original brass key Daniel had carried on his keyring. The lock resisted at first. Then with a dull click, it finally surrendered. She stood silently inside. The familiar smell was still there. Old rubber, motor oil soaked into concrete, dust, steel, memories. William Carter remained a few steps behind her. He said nothing. This wasn't his moment. Joan slowly walked across the cracked floor. Her boots echoed through the empty bays. She stopped beside an old workbench that somehow remained exactly where Daniel had left it years earlier. Her fingers brushed across its scarred wooden surface. Tiny cuts, burn marks, hammer dents. Every imperfection had a story. She smiled through moist eyes. "You kept waiting for us." William quietly looked around. No architect could have designed this room with more honesty. Nothing had been preserved for beauty. Everything carried evidence of work. Joan reached into her jacket pocket and unfolded Daniel's faded red shop towel. She carefully wiped years of dust from the workbench, only one small section, just enough to reveal the worn wood beneath. William recognized the gesture immediately. She wasn't cleaning. She was welcoming the building home. By 8 o'clock, volunteers began arriving. None had received expensive invitations. No advertising campaign announced the project. The news had traveled the old-fashioned way. One neighbor told another. A former customer called a friend. Someone mentioned Joan at church. Someone else mentioned Daniel at the diner. People simply came. An electrician arrived carrying his own ladder. A retired plumber brought boxes of spare fittings. 2 high school students unloaded paint supplies. A landscaping company donated mulch and shrubs. Even Maggie, the waitress from the diner, appeared, carrying trays of homemade cinnamon rolls and hot coffee. William watched in amazement. No one asked who was paying. No one asked whether television cameras were coming. They simply started working. Around mid-morning, Ethan Brooks pulled into the parking lot with 2 pickup trucks full of construction materials. He climbed out holding a clipboard. "I brought the delivery schedule." Joan looked at the stacks of lumber. "This is more than I expected." William smiled. "You asked for enough. You didn't ask for luxury. So we bought durability." She nodded approvingly. "Good." Then she surprised everyone. "Before anybody picks up a hammer." The volunteers looked toward her. "We're dividing into teams." She quickly organized the work. One group removed broken drywall. Another repaired lighting. Someone pressure washed the exterior. Retired mechanics sorted old tools. Teenagers swept decades of dust from storage rooms. Nobody stood around wondering what to do. William quietly joined a cleanup crew. An elderly volunteer handed him a broom. "Ever used one of these?" William laughed. "My father would have fired me if I hadn't." The old man grinned. "Good answer." Within an hour, William's expensive jeans were streaked with dirt. Dust covered his boots. Sweat darkened the back of his shirt. For reasons he couldn't explain, he felt happier than he had after any shareholder meeting in recent memory. At lunchtime, everyone gathered outside beneath temporary tents. Paper plates, foldable chairs, homemade casseroles, potato salad, barbecue sandwiches. No catering company. No speeches. Frank Rogers slowly stood using his cane. The conversations faded. I've spent most of my life fixing machines. His voice trembled slightly. But today, he looked around at the volunteers. I'm watching people repair something much harder. He gestured toward the garage. A place. Then toward Joan. A promise. Silence settled over the crowd. Frank smiled proudly. My daughter thinks she's rebuilding a garage. He looked toward William. She's actually rebuilding faith. Nobody applauded immediately. Some simply lowered their heads. Others quietly wiped away tears. William looked across the parking lot. He had funded hospitals, university buildings, research centers. Yet somehow this simple gathering felt more meaningful, perhaps because every person present had chosen to come. Not because of grants, not because of publicity, because someone they trusted had once repaired more than their vehicle. After lunch, Joan climbed onto an old ladder to inspect the overhead lighting. William walked over instinctively. I'll hold it. She smiled. I figured you would. He steadied the ladder while she worked. After a few moments, she looked down. You know? What? 3 months ago, if you'd offered to hold my ladder, I probably would have said no. William laughed. I believe you. You know why? Because you thought I wanted control. She nodded. And now? Now you're just making sure I don't fall. He smiled. That's a much better job. Late that afternoon, Ethan approached William quietly. The accounting department needs to know how we're recording all this. William looked confused. Recording what? The donations? The labor? The construction expenses. William glanced toward Joan, who was teaching 2 teenagers how to restore an old tool cabinet instead of replacing it. No marketing budget. No charitable branding. No press release. Ethan stared at him. None. William shook his head. This isn't a Carter project. It's a community project. But you're paying for most of it. William smiled. That doesn't make it mine. Ethan looked across the garage. For years he had watched billionaires attach their names to every building they funded. This was different. Very different. As sunset painted the sky with the shades of orange and gold, the transformation became visible. The parking lot had been cleared. Broken windows replaced. Fresh paint covered the front entrance. The old Rogers family auto sign had been carefully removed. Not discarded, restored. Joan stood holding the freshly repainted sign while volunteers admired it. The original lettering remained, only brighter, cleaner, hopeful. She turned toward William. I have one more thing. She disappeared into the office for a moment before returning with Daniel's old toolbox. It looked worn but sturdy. She opened it slowly. Inside lay the faded red shop towel, carefully folded. Beside it rested Daniel's favorite combination wrench. Joan picked up the towel. Without speaking, she walked to the center workbench and gently draped it across one corner. Not hidden inside a drawer, not framed behind glass. Exactly where a working mechanic would naturally leave it. William understood immediately. The towel wasn't a memorial. It was a reminder. Work built with love never truly ends. Frank looked around the brightened garage and whispered softly enough that only William heard him. Daniel would have felt right at home. William nodded. So do I. For the first time in many years, neither man was thinking about what had been lost. They were thinking about everything that was about to begin. The first day of classes began on a crisp Monday morning in early September. At exactly 7:30 a.m., Joan Rogers unlocked the front door of the restored garage. The new sign above the entrance read simply, Rogers Community Garage and Training Center. Nothing beneath it mentioned William Carter. Nothing mentioned Carter Automotive Technologies. Nothing hinted at billion-dollar investments. That had been intentional. Joan believed the people walking through the door deserved to feel they were entering a place built for them, not a monument to someone else's generosity. Inside the building looked different without losing its soul. The concrete floors had been repaired, but not covered. The original workbenches remained carefully restored instead of replaced. New hydraulic lifts stood beside old steel tool cabinets that still carried scratches from decades of honest work. Daniel's faded red shop towel rested exactly where it always had, folded neatly on the center workbench. It had become an unspoken symbol. No one touched it without permission. By 8 o'clock, 12 students had arrived. Their ages ranged from 19 to 56. Their stories could not have been more different. Lucas Bennett, 21, had dropped out of high school after his mother became ill. He had worked construction, washed dishes, stocked grocery shelves, and slept in his car more than once. Angela Morris, 38, was a single mother raising 2 daughters while working nights as a hotel housekeeper. Robert Jenkins, 56, had served in the Army for 28 years before retiring with injured knees and no clear idea how to begin a second career. Miguel Alvarez had spent 5 years rebuilding his life after overcoming addiction. Others carried stories they weren't yet ready to tell. Joan welcomed each person with the same simple handshake. No speeches, no inspirational music, no motivational banners covered the walls. Instead, she handed every student a clean pair of work gloves. "These belong to the shop," she said. "Take care of them, and they'll take care of you." Lucas looked around nervously. "I've never done anything like this." Joan smiled. "That's why you're here." She gathered everyone around the center workbench. Daniel's red towel lay quietly beside a small toolbox. Several students glanced at it with curiosity. Joan noticed. "That towel belonged to my husband." Silence settled over the room. He believed every mechanic had 2 responsibilities. She placed one hand gently on the folded cloth. "Fix the vehicle." Then she looked at every student, and leave the owner feeling safer than when they arrived. Nobody wrote the sentence down. They didn't need to. It stayed with them. William stood near the back of the garage beside Ethan Brooks. Neither man interrupted. Neither wore business suits. William had chosen jeans and work boots again. He wanted to be another observer, not a guest of honor. Joan divided the students into pairs. Today's assignment wasn't rebuilding an engine. It wasn't replacing brakes. It wasn't using expensive diagnostic computers. Instead, she rolled an old lawnmower into the middle of the room. Confused expressions spread across several faces. Lucas whispered, "That's it." Joan heard him. She smiled. "If you can learn patience with something small, you'll have it when something expensive comes along." The students laughed softly. For the next hour, she didn't touch a single wrench. She asked questions instead. "What do you hear? What do you smell? What changed? Why do you think that happened?" Every answer mattered, even the wrong ones. When Miguel apologized for making a mistake, Joan shook her head. Mistakes are tuition. Dishonesty is failure. William quietly wrote those words into Harold's notebook. Around mid-morning, Lucas struggled to remove a rusted bolt. He pulled harder. The wrench slipped. His frustration grew. "I can't do this." Joan walked over. She didn't take the wrench. She didn't show him the answer. Instead, she crouched beside him. "What are you feeling?" Lucas frowned. Annoyed. "Where?" "My hands." "No." She smiled gently. "The wrench?" He paused. Then closed his eyes for a moment. "It's slipping." "Why?" "I don't know." "What changed?" He looked again. "The angle." She nodded. "Now you're listening." Lucas adjusted his position slightly. The bolt loosened almost immediately. His eyes widened. "That was—" He laughed. "Actually easy." Joan smiled. "It became easy after you stopped fighting it." William recognized the lesson immediately. She wasn't teaching mechanics. She was teaching how to think. During lunch, everyone gathered around folding tables outside the garage. No one sat separately. Joan carried sandwiches from Maggie's corner diner. Maggie herself had insisted on providing lunch every Monday. When William offered to reimburse her, she refused. Joan already paid me years ago. He understood exactly what she meant. Robert, the retired veteran, looked toward William during lunch. You own that old blue pickup? William smiled. I do. Beautiful truck. It belonged to my father. Robert nodded thoughtfully. My father left me his toolbox. William looked at him. I've never used it. Why not? I was afraid of wearing it out. Joan overheard the conversation. She walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. The fastest way to lose a good tool. She placed 1 cup in front of Robert. Is never letting it work again. Robert stared quietly into his coffee. The sentence reached him in ways no one else fully understood. After lunch came the first real repair. An elderly widow named Mrs. Evelyn Parker drove in with an aging Buick whose air conditioner had stopped working. She apologized repeatedly. I don't have much money. Before anyone could respond, Joan addressed the class. Today's customer isn't here to become our practice project. She looked each student in the eyes. She's trusting us. That trust is worth more than the repair bill. Every student straightened a little. Lucas whispered to Angela, Nobody's ever said it like that before. Together they diagnosed the problem under Joan's guidance. A worn relay, nothing more. The replacement cost less than $15. Mrs. Parker looked relieved. I was afraid someone would tell me I needed an entirely new system. Joan smiled. Sometimes people hear expensive answers before anyone asks simple questions. William watched Mrs. Parker drive away with cool air flowing through her vents and a smile on her face. He turned toward Ethan. Do you know what this place reminds me of? Ethan looked around. What? My father's garage. Ethan smiled. I was thinking the same thing. William shook his head. No. My father's garage fixed cars. He watched Lucas helping sweep the floor without being asked. This place is rebuilding people. As the students cleaned their stations before going home, Joan noticed Lucas lingering beside Daniel's old toolbox. Something on your mind? He hesitated. I've never been good at anything. Joan looked at the workbench. Then she unfolded the faded red towel and handed it to him. Lucas froze. I can't. You can. She smiled. Wipe down the bench. He carefully cleaned the surface before folding the towel exactly as he had found it. When he handed it back, Joan nodded with quiet approval. You know what you just learned? Lucas shook his head. Respect. She tucked the towel into its familiar place. The rest will come. From across the garage, William watched the exchange in silence. For the first time since meeting Joan beside the highway, he fully understood what had drawn him to those scarred hands in the rain. They had never been remarkable because of what they had repaired. They were remarkable because they knew how to place confidence into someone else's hands, one small lesson at a time. 6 months after the Rogers Community Garage and Training Center opened its doors, the waiting list had grown beyond anything Joan Rogers had imagined. The original class of 12 students had become 34. Applications arrived from neighboring counties every week. Single parents hoping for a second chance. Young adults who had never been able to afford technical school. Veterans searching for a new purpose. Even a few retired mechanics had volunteered to teach one afternoon each week, saying they finally had a place where experience was treated as something valuable instead of outdated. The garage was alive from sunrise until evening. Engines hummed. Laughter echoed through the service bays. Mistakes were made. Lessons were learned. Nobody rushed anyone. One Tuesday morning, Ethan Brooks arrived carrying a thick envelope. He looked unusually serious. William asked me to bring this to both of you. Joan wiped her hands with Daniel's faded red shop towel before opening the envelope. Inside was a proposal from one of the country's largest automotive investment firms. The numbers were staggering. The company offered enough funding to build training centers across 10 states. Brand new facilities, state-of-the-art equipment, scholarship programs, national expansion. At first glance, it looked like everything Joan had once dreamed of. She continued reading. Then her expression changed. William, who had arrived only minutes earlier, noticed immediately. "What is it?" She handed him the proposal without speaking. He scanned the highlighted section. Every new center would carry the investor's corporate name. Students would wear branded uniforms. Training materials would feature company advertising. Graduation ceremonies would become media events promoting the sponsor's products. Community repair days would prioritize customers who purchased vehicles from affiliated dealerships. William frowned. "It wasn't presented this way." Joan folded the papers carefully. "It never is." A long silence settled over the office. Finally, William spoke. "They're offering enough money to help thousands of people." "They are. And that matters." "It does." He looked at her. "So why do you seem disappointed?" Joan walked into the main garage. Lucas was helping an elderly customer replace windshield wipers. Angela patiently explained tire pressure to a young mother. Robert laughed while showing another student how to rebuild an old starter motor. None of them noticed Joan watching. She turned back toward William. "Tell me what you see." He looked around. "I see students." "What else?" "Confidence." "What else?" He searched for another answer. "Trust." She nodded. "Exactly." Then she held up the proposal. "This document never mentions trust. It mentions expansion. It mentions branding. It mentions market visibility." She looked directly at him. "But not once does it ask how the people inside these walls will feel." William lowered his eyes. She wasn't wrong. He knew exactly how these agreements worked. First came sponsorship, then performance targets, then marketing expectations. Eventually, every decision answered to someone outside the community. That wasn't what they had built. Later that afternoon, representatives from the investment firm arrived for a meeting. 3 executives, expensive suits, confident smiles. One of them, Richard Collins, spoke enthusiastically as architectural renderings appeared on a large presentation screen. "Imagine 50 facilities just like this." He clicked to another slide. "National recognition." Another click. "Television partnerships." Another. "Corporate ambassadors." William listened quietly. Joan remained silent. Richard smiled at her. "Miss Rogers, you'll become one of the most recognized voices in skilled trades education." Joan asked only one question. "Will students still be admitted based on need?" Richard hesitated. "Our selection process would naturally align with long-term business objectives." Joan understood immediately. Need would become secondary. She asked another question. If a school bus driver couldn't afford repairs, but drove a vehicle outside your partner network, would our emergency repair fund still help? The executives exchanged brief glances. Richard answered carefully. "We'd have to review those situations individually." Joan looked toward William. Neither of them spoke. But they no longer needed words. The answer had already been given. After the meeting ended, the executives left optimistic. They assumed negotiations would continue. Instead, William closed the conference room door. He remained standing for several moments. Then he walked to the window overlooking the garage floor. Students continued working below. No one knew millions of dollars had just entered and possibly left the building. William finally broke the silence. "A year ago, I would have signed that agreement before lunch." Joan smiled gently. "I know." I would have called it responsible leadership. You probably would have. He laughed quietly. And now, she waited, I keep hearing my father's voice. Joan looked at him. What did he used to say? William smiled. He'd tell young mechanics, never polish a wrench so much that you're afraid to use it. He looked down at the proposal. I think that's what this is. She nodded. It would become too polished. And, eventually, too expensive to serve the people who need it most. William slowly picked up the contract. Without drama, without anger. He folded it once, then twice. He placed it back into the envelope. I'm saying no. Joan didn't celebrate. She simply smiled with quiet gratitude. Thank you. For what? For remembering why we started. William laughed softly. I almost forgot. She pointed toward the service bay, where Lucas had just successfully diagnosed an electrical problem without assistance. No. You remembered. You just needed someone to remind you. That evening, William gathered the students before closing time. No stage, no microphones, just everyone standing together inside the garage. I owe all of you something. The room grew quiet. Today I had an opportunity to make this organization much larger. Several students exchanged curious glances. I turned it down. Confused expressions appeared. William continued, because somewhere along the way, I learned that bigger and better are not always the same thing. He looked toward Joan. This place exists because every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity. If we ever have to choose between protecting that dignity and growing faster, we already know which choice we're making. Lucas was the first to clap. Then Angela, then Robert. Soon the entire garage filled with applause, not because they had rejected millions of dollars, but because every person there understood something deeper. For the first time in many years, someone with enormous power had chosen to protect people instead of prestige. As everyone returned to cleaning their workstations, Joan quietly unfolded Daniel's faded red shop towel and wiped the center workbench one final time before locking up. William watched her from across the room. Months earlier, he had stopped because he noticed her scarred hands in the rain. Now he realized those hands had done something far more remarkable. Without demanding anything in return, they had quietly taught a billionaire that the strongest foundations were never built with money alone. They were built with principles strong enough to survive the temptation to sell them. The decision to reject the investment offer spread through the community faster than anyone expected. No official announcement had been made. No press conference had been scheduled. Someone who had attended the meeting mentioned it to a friend. A retired mechanic repeated the story at the diner. Maggie overheard it while pouring coffee, and by the following weekend, nearly everyone in the neighborhood knew that Rogers' community garage had turned down millions of dollars rather than compromise its mission. The surprising part wasn't the amount of money. It was the reason. People couldn't stop talking about it. One Thursday morning, William received a phone call from Megan Foster, a reporter for the Columbus Dispatch. I've been trying to reach you for 3 days. I've been avoiding interviews. I know. She laughed softly. That's exactly why I'm calling. William smiled. What have you heard? I've heard that a billionaire refused to put his own name on a training center. And? I'd like to know why. William looked through his office window toward the city skyline. Because it wasn't my story to name. There was silence on the other end. Finally, Megan asked, May I quote that? You may? What about the woman who started all this? William smiled. You should ask her. I'm trying. She keeps declining interviews. I know. That's one of the reasons people trust her. 2 days later, Megan drove to the garage anyway. She didn't arrive with a television crew. Only a notebook and a small camera hung over her shoulder. She found Joan beneath the hood of an aging Chevrolet pickup, while Lucas Bennett stood beside her taking notes. When Joan finished adjusting the timing belt, Megan introduced herself. "I promise I won't take much of your time." Joan smiled politely. "I'm afraid I don't have anything interesting to say." "I doubt that." Megan looked around the busy garage. "I've interviewed senators, CEOs, athletes, and actors. They all wanted to tell me who they were." She paused. "You're the first person who's spent 10 minutes trying to avoid me." Lucas laughed. "That's normal." Joan gave him a playful look. "Don't encourage reporters." Everyone laughed. Eventually, Joan agreed to sit down for a short conversation. Megan opened her notebook. "People say you turned down the chance to become nationally famous." Joan shrugged. "I repair cars." "Fame doesn't tighten bolts." Megan smiled. "That's probably going to become tomorrow's headline." "I hope not." "Why?" "Because headlines disappear." She glanced toward the students working inside. "I'd rather people remember what those young mechanics become." Megan looked down at her notes. "What made you believe this center would succeed?" Joan thought for a long moment. "I didn't." "You didn't know?" "I believed people were waiting for someone to believe in them." "That's different." The answer stayed with Megan. Before leaving, she noticed Daniel's faded red shop towel folded on the center workbench. "What does that towel mean?" Joan carefully picked it up. "It reminds us." "Of your husband." "Yes." "But also of something else." She unfolded the cloth. "It reminds every student that honest work leaves marks." She ran her fingers gently across the worn fabric. "And those marks are never something to hide." The article appeared on Sunday. Its title surprised everyone. Not "Billionaire Builds Training Center," not "$1 Million Project Changes Lives." Instead, Megan chose a different headline. "The Hands That Refused to Quit." The story spread across social media within hours. Readers weren't captivated by William's wealth. They were moved by Joan's quiet dignity. Thousands of messages arrived. Former mechanics offered to volunteer. Small tool manufacturers donated equipment. Local diners pledged free lunches once a week. A retired accountant offered bookkeeping services. A widow mailed $27 with a handwritten note. "It isn't much, but this is what my husband would have wanted." No one donation was large. Together, they became something extraordinary. On Monday afternoon, William drove to the garage carrying a long cardboard box. Joan looked up. "What did you bring?" "A mistake I should have corrected years ago." He placed the box on the workbench. Inside lay a polished brass plaque. Joan immediately frowned. "If that's going on the building," William interrupted. "It isn't." She looked relieved. "What is it?" He handed it to her. The inscription read, "The Working Hands Initiative, dedicated to every mechanic, technician, and tradesperson whose quiet skill keeps families moving, communities working, and strangers safe. No founder's name, no corporate logo, no donor recognition, nothing." Joan smiled. "This belongs inside." "I thought so." Together they carried it to the classroom. Not the front entrance, not the lobby. The classroom. The place where every student would see it before touching a wrench. Later that evening, the current class gathered for their weekly discussion. William stood quietly near the back as Joan addressed the students. "When people hear the word success," she looked around the room, "what do they usually imagine?" "Bigger paychecks," someone answered. "A nicer house." "A better truck." "Owning your own business." Joan nodded after each response. "Those are all good things." She paused. "But here's another definition." She pointed toward the new plaque. "Success is when someone you've taught no longer needs you." The room became silent. Lucas lowered his eyes thoughtfully. Angela smiled. Robert slowly nodded. William felt the sentence settle deeply inside him. Every company he had ever built depended on people needing him. Joan measured success by exactly the opposite. After class ended, Lucas remained behind. He approached William somewhat nervously. "Mr. Carter." "Yes." "I wanted to thank you." William smiled. "You don't owe me thanks." "I kind of do." Lucas rubbed the back of his neck. 6 months ago, I couldn't even get an interview." He looked toward the service bay. "Today, a dealership offered me a full-time position." William's face lit up. "Congratulations." Lucas shook his head. "I'm staying. For now." "You are?" "I promised I'd help teach the next class." William looked across the garage at Joan. She was organizing tools without paying attention to the conversation, without speeches, without demanding loyalty. She had inspired it naturally. As Lucas walked away, William quietly opened Harold Carter's notebook one more time. On the final blank page, he wrote, "Dad was right. People remember your hands long before they remember your name." He closed the notebook and slipped it into his jacket. For the first time in decades, he no longer felt the pressure to build something larger. Instead, he found himself grateful to be part of something that was already growing exactly as it should, through trust, humility, and one pair of working hands reaching out to another. 3 years passed more quickly than anyone expected. The little garage that many people once dismissed as an impossible dream had become one of the most respected community trade schools in central Ohio. Not because it was the largest, not because it had the newest equipment, and certainly not because it had the biggest budget. People respected it because every graduate left with something far more valuable than a certificate. They left believing their work mattered. On a bright Saturday morning in late May, colorful banners stretched across the parking lot as families gathered for another graduation ceremony. Children chased each other between restored pickup trucks. Retired mechanics swapped stories over coffee. Former students returned wearing uniforms from dealerships, independent repair shops, transit companies, and municipal maintenance departments. The atmosphere felt less like a formal graduation and more like a neighborhood reunion. Joan Rogers stood near the entrance, greeting every family personally. She remembered nearly every name, every struggle, every first day. Lucas Bennett arrived wearing a clean navy work shirt embroidered with the words, "Bennett Automotive Service." Joan smiled the moment she saw it. "So?" She folded her arms playfully. "I hear somebody opened his own garage." Lucas laughed. "I was hoping the news wouldn't travel this fast." "In this town," she shook her head, "nothing stays secret." He handed her a small envelope. "I brought something." Joan opened it. Inside was a photograph. The front of Lucas's new garage looked modest but welcoming. Flower boxes sat beneath the windows. Fresh white paint covered the brick walls. Above the entrance hung a simple sign, "Bennett Automotive." But something in the picture immediately caught Joan's attention. Just inside the open service bay, hanging neatly from a hook beside the main workbench, was a faded red shop towel. Her eyes lingered on it. "You found one?" Lucas smiled. "No. I earned one." Joan looked up. "It belonged to my grandfather. I asked my mother if she still had any of his tools." He hesitated. "She found that towel folded inside his old toolbox." Joan gently traced the edge of the photograph. "I thought," Lucas continued quietly, "that if your towel reminds people that honest work leaves marks, maybe mine can remind me where I came from." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Some traditions didn't need long explanations. Across the parking lot, William Carter watched the conversation from a distance. His hair had become noticeably grayer over the past 3 years. He spent fewer days inside executive boardrooms now. Instead, he visited the training center almost every Friday. Sometimes he helped organize tools. Sometimes he simply drank coffee with retired mechanics while listening to stories. He had discovered something unexpected. The older he became, the more he enjoyed listening instead of speaking. Frank Rogers slowly walked over with the help of a cane. Parkinson's had stolen even more of his strength, yet his eyes still carried the same quiet warmth. He looked toward Lucas's photograph. "Looks familiar." Lucas smiled. "I borrowed a few ideas." Frank laughed. "Good. The world doesn't need more copies. It needs people who understand the original." Nearby Maggie's Corner Diner had set up long tables filled with sandwiches, homemade pies, and lemonade, just like the first volunteer workday years earlier. Some traditions deserved repeating. The graduation ceremony itself remained simple. No celebrity speakers, no expensive stage, only folding chairs arranged beneath the shade of old maple trees. When Joan stepped to the small wooden podium, the crowd became quiet. She looked at the graduates before saying a single word. Some wore pressed shirts. Others still had grease beneath their fingernails after finishing morning repairs before coming to the ceremony. She smiled. "I hope you never become embarrassed by your hands." Many students instinctively looked down. "When I was younger, I thought these scars would make people underestimate me." She held up her left hand. The old burn marks remained. The white scars still crossed her knuckles. "I spent years trying to scrub away engine grease." Soft laughter spread through the audience. "It never completely disappeared." She smiled. "Now I'm thankful." She slowly lowered her hand. "Because every mark reminds me that I built something instead of pretending to." Silence settled gently across the gathering. Joan looked toward the graduates. "You are going to repair engines, brakes, steering systems, electrical problems. But if that's all you repair, you'll never understand this profession." She paused. "Every customer who walks through your door is carrying something you cannot see. A sick child, a mortgage, a divorce, a military deployment, a lonely retirement." She looked around the audience. "Fix the vehicle honestly, but don't forget the person standing beside it." Several parents quietly wiped tears from their eyes. William felt Harold Carter's notebook in his jacket pocket. He no longer carried it every day. Most of its lessons had become habits instead of reminders. After the ceremony, graduates lined up to receive certificates. When Lucas stepped forward, Joan hugged him before handing over the framed document. "You don't need this anymore." He looked puzzled. "What?" She reached into the center workbench inside the garage and returned carrying Daniel's faded red shop towel. The entire crowd fell silent. Joan unfolded it one last time. Then, instead of placing it back on the workbench, she tore off a tiny strip from one worn corner. Gasps rippled through the audience. She folded the small piece carefully and placed it into Lucas's hand. "The rest stays here." Her voice remained steady. "But every generation deserves a reminder." Lucas stared at the tiny piece of faded red fabric resting in his palm. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to." She smiled. "Just pass it on someday." Lucas closed his fingers around it as though holding something priceless. Because he was. Not because the cloth had monetary value, because it carried responsibility. As the sun began to set behind the old garage, children laughed in the parking lot while graduates posed for photographs with parents, instructors, and classmates. William stood quietly beside Frank. "You were right." Frank smiled. "About what?" "Years ago you told me Joan wasn't rebuilding a garage." He watched another class of graduates celebrating together. "You said she was rebuilding faith." Frank looked toward his daughter. "No." He shook his head gently. "I was wrong." William looked at him. "She's rebuilding people." Frank's smile grew wider. And those tend to last a whole lot longer than buildings. It was raining again. Not the violent storm that had brought two strangers together years earlier, but a slow, steady spring rain that wrapped the Ohio highway in a quiet, gray haze. William Carter drove the old blue Ford F-150 himself. He no longer hurried through this stretch of Route 33. Every few months he found himself returning without quite knowing why. Perhaps he wanted to remember. Perhaps he wanted to make sure the man he had become hadn't disappeared beneath meetings and responsibilities. The windshield wipers moved with a familiar rhythm, back and forth, back and forth. Just ahead, flashing hazard lights appeared on the shoulder. William slowed instinctively. A compact SUV sat with its hood raised. Beside it stood a young mother holding an umbrella over two children. Kneeling in front of the engine was a young woman wearing a gray work jacket embroidered with a simple name, Lucas Automotive. William smiled before he had even parked. He knew exactly who she was. Emily Turner had been one of the second class of students at Rogers Community Garage. She had once doubted she belonged in the trade because every repair shop she applied to insisted customers preferred experienced men. Joan had answered with the same sentence she gave everyone. Engines don't care who's listening. They only care whether someone listens well. William stepped out of the truck. Emily looked up briefly. Good afternoon. You've got this under control. I think so. She pointed toward the battery terminal. Loose connection? The young mother looked embarrassed. I'm sorry to bother everyone. Emily smiled warmly. You're not bothering anyone? William recognized those words. Years earlier, Joan had spoken almost the same sentence to Grace Collins during the storm. History wasn't repeating itself. Kindness was. William stayed back. He didn't offer instructions. He didn't take over. He simply held the umbrella while Emily tightened the terminal. A few minutes later, the SUV started immediately. The little boy inside clapped excitedly. The young mother reached into her purse. Please! I have to pay you. Emily shook her head. You can if you want. She handed the woman a business card. But if money's tight, she smiled, just help somebody else when it's your turn. William quietly laughed. The circle had become complete. Emily wasn't repeating Joan's words because someone told her to. She had made them her own. After the family drove away, Emily finally recognized William. Mr. Carter, it's good to see you. You too. She glanced toward the old blue pickup. You still drive your father's truck? As often as I can. She looked at him curiously. Did you stop because you recognized me? William looked toward the wet highway. No. Then why? He smiled. Because years ago, someone taught me that when you see a person working alone in the rain, you don't keep driving. Emily nodded. I understand. They stood quietly for a moment, listening to the rain. Not every silence needed filling. Later that afternoon, William continued toward Rogers Community Garage. The building looked even more alive than before. Fresh flowers lined the entrance. Several customer vehicles waited outside. Inside, apprentices worked confidently, while retired mechanics moved patiently from one workbench to another, answering questions only after students had tried to solve problems themselves. Joan stood near the center workbench helping a teenage apprentice rebuild his first carburetor. Her hair now carried a few silver strands. The scars on her hands remained exactly as William remembered. Some things should never disappear. She looked up and smiled. You took the long way again. I always do. Everything okay? William nodded. I met Emily on Route 33. Joan laughed softly. Someone needed help. Yes. And she handled it beautifully. I knew she would. William looked around the garage. Photographs covered one wall now. Graduating classes, volunteer repair days, families standing proudly beside their first repaired cars. None of the pictures showed expensive ceremonies. They showed ordinary moments, which made them extraordinary. Joan walked toward the center workbench. Daniel's faded red shop towel still rested there. Time had made the fabric even softer. The edges had frayed. Its color had faded almost to rust. Yet no one suggested replacing it. Some things gained value precisely because they had endured. A young apprentice approached hesitantly. "Miss Rogers?" "Yes." "My hands." He looked embarrassed. "They're starting to look like yours." Joan smiled. She gently took his rough hands in hers. William watched from only a few feet away. Those same scarred hands that had once caught his attention beneath a storm now rested over another pair just beginning their own journey. Joan spoke quietly. "Don't ever be ashamed of these." The apprentice listened carefully. "They're proof that you learned something honestly." She released his hands. Then she looked toward William. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Neither needed to say what both were thinking. Everything had begun because one person chose to stop. One person chose to notice. One person chose to look beyond appearances. Before leaving that afternoon, William removed Harold Carter's leather notebook from his jacket. He walked to the classroom where the brass plaque hung on the wall. Without anyone noticing, he placed the notebook inside the small library cabinet beneath it. On the inside cover, he wrote one final sentence. "For whoever learns here next, never forget that the strongest tools you will ever own are the hands that serve with honesty and the heart that refuses to look away." He closed the notebook gently. It no longer belonged to him alone. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, reflecting across the wet pavement, where years earlier a woman had knelt beside a stranded car with a faded red towel in her pocket. William stood for a long moment, watching apprentices laugh as they rolled another toolbox across the garage floor. He realized he could no longer remember the quarterly profits from the year he met Joan Rogers. He couldn't remember the stock price. He couldn't remember the headlines. But he remembered her hands. And he knew he always would. Life has a quiet way of testing what we truly value. It rarely happens in boardrooms or on stages. More often it happens on a rainy roadside, in a small workshop, or during an ordinary conversation that changes the way we see another person. Joan Rogers never became extraordinary because she was rescued by a billionaire. She became extraordinary because she refused to let hardship take away her integrity. William Carter's greatest gift was not his wealth. It was his willingness to learn to change and to use his influence without demanding recognition in return. Real kindness does not always solve every problem overnight. Sometimes it simply gives another person enough dignity, confidence, or opportunity to keep moving forward. And when that person helps someone else, kindness stops being a single act. It becomes a legacy. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from, and what lessons stayed with you the most. If someone in your life taught you the value of honest work, share their story in the comments. They deserve to be remembered. And if you enjoy stories about compassion, resilience, and second chances, consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey.